personal dietary choices are an extraordinarily important cause. In fact, they're the single biggest cause of lost years of healthy life in the developed world, and they're a really strong competitor for the single biggest cause in the developing world, too. Unhealthy dietary choices are 5 times as important as physical inactivity as a driver of premature death and disease. And so for that reason, and they're the major thing behind this skyrocketing rate of global obesity. This is in the US, but the global rate the curve looks pretty similar. And for this reason, cost-effective, scalable interventions to get people to change their dietary choices are a very important scientific priority. They have been for about 30 years. And by the way, the changes don't have to be big to be very important. So for example, there was an estimate published in The Lancet in 2011 that as of 2011, as little as a 20-calorie per person reduction on average across the US and UK would have gotten those countries to 1990s levels of obesity within 3 years. It's a tiny, tiny change. But it's got to be on a massive scale, and it's got to be sustained. And so because it's been this scientific priority, there have been lots of people who've tried to develop interventions to get people to change their dietary habits. They tend to focus on the classroom, partly because you want large-scale change, and schools are one of the rare opportunities to get access to basically the entire population at a given age. And so one thing that these interventions basically all have in common is that they involve some combination of health and nutrition education, so what's good for you, what's bad for you, how do you read nutrition labels, and what's called skills training, and that usually involves a combination of learning how to set realistic goals, analyzing barriers to behavior change, that sort of thing. The other big thing they all have in common is that they've failed, right? So people have been trying to do this for like 30 years. I'm not aware of a single intervention that keeps affecting people's behavior after you stop intervening. And I think the major reason for this is that they all share, either implicitly or explicitly, an underlying assumption, and that is that long-term self-interest, the desire to be healthy in the distant future, is an effective motivator for teenagers. And I mean, I don't need citations, but I have them, but like, obviously that's not the case. And so our approach has been to, rather than trying to get adolescents to care about things they don't care about, reframe the meaning of healthy eating so that it's consistent with the things they do care about. We focus on 3 major values in particular. One is the sort of well-known teen drive to rebel against adult authority. Adolescents hate doing what adults tell them to do. They'll often do the opposite just to reassert their autonomy. Less widely appreciated is adolescence is a period where there's a real increase in concern for fairness and justice and beyond the self aims. Just to give you a couple of quick examples, this is the time in life when people often first decide to become vegetarians for moral reasons or anti-globalization activists. They have a sense of themselves as agents in the world for the first time, and they want to make the world a better place. And unlike most adults, they're not yet jaded about their prospects for doing that. Yeah, this collection of optimistic people is the wrong place to make that cynical joke. Okay, and then the third big value is going to be familiar again, and that's the drive for peer approval and status. It's certainly not unique to adolescence, but it actually is very strongly heightened in adolescence, and a big reason for that is that the central task, developmental task of adolescence is figuring out how to be a social agent. So if you're going to do that, you need to be very attentive to what's being approved of and what's not. And so what we did to try to appeal to these 3 values was essentially took a twofold approach. The first is we framed the entire intervention as an expose of manipulative food industry marketing practices aimed at tricking people into eating more junk food than they would naturally be inclined to eat. Here I'm talking about things like using deceptive labeling to conceal the sugar content in food, or spending unbelievable sums of money on laboratories that are specifically designed to figure out how you can formulate foods to make them as addictive as possible. The second thing we did was emphasize the social justice consequences of this food marketing. And here I'm talking in particular about disproportionately targeting very young children, poor people, and minorities with marketing of the unhealthiest foods because they're easy targets. And so our goal here was to frame healthy eating as a way to stick it to the man, to rebel against a controlling adult authority figure who's trying to control us, and as a way to stand up for people who are less able to defend themselves, both of which were sort of deliberately crafted to appeal to the sort of adolescent set of values and sensibilities. And so essentially what we were aiming to do here was to replace what we imagined adolescents' sort of default construal, their default understanding of what a healthy eater is, something like healthy eaters are lame nerds who do what adults tell them to do, with an alternative construal. Healthy eaters are independent-minded people who are fighting to make the world a fairer place.